regional carriers make it to the next level. So leading the conversation is Chetan Sharma, founder and president of Chetan Sharma Consulting, and a leading strategist in the mobile industry. In addition to heading a thriving consulting business, Chetan has authored and edited 10 books on wireless technology. I really believe Chetan is one of the leading analysts in the field for wireless and advanced telecommunications. So it's a great pleasure to have him joining us. So why don't we welcome Chetan Sharma and the panel of experts that are going to join him. Chetan. All right.
Hey, thanks, Steve.
Thank you. I'll let you guys get set up.
Good morning, everyone.
Hey, good to see you.
Last time I went to a CCA event, it took me about 14 hours. And this morning, it took me about 14 minutes. So welcome to Seattle. I hope you had time to spend some time in Seattle. We have some lovely weather. So we have a great panel today with excellent panelists. I'm just going to kick off with some thoughts on what the state of the industry is, and then we'll dive into Q&A. So I hope everybody's excited about 5G and what's coming with IoT. But before that, I just wanted to give a sense of where 5G lies in the historic evolution of the cycle. So if you look at the history of technology, it generally comes in 30, 40-year cycles. And it has been studied by economists over 100 years. And I believe that we are at the start of that next cycle that's built on telecom and internet services that have been with us for the last 30, 40 years. And so if you look forward, you see that the age of information and telecom is at its golden age and starting to with connected intelligence, which is built on networks, built on sensors, smart algorithms, AI and machine intelligence, and so on and so forth. It's leading us to into a new cycle of investments, and we see that across verticals around the world. And so I will posit that in the next 10 years, the global output is going to be in excess of $1,000 trillion, and connected intelligence will play a critical role. And that's where the networks, that's where IoT, sensors, smart algorithms come into play. And as has happened in the last 200, 300 years, you see the GDP growth go 2x, 3x from the previous generation. And I think with connected intelligence, we're likely to see that go probably 5x over the next 30 years. Other folks have started to talk about it as well in other terms, like the World Economic Forum talks about the fourth industrial revolution or Industry 4.0 and so on and so forth. But it's not something new. It has been evolving over the last 200 years. IoT in some form or other has been around for literally 200 years when people were detonating remote mines in warfare. But now with connected intelligence, you are getting to a point where you can do a lot of these functions autonomously, meaning you can have these sensors in place which self-learn and self-regulate and self-act. As such, we are seeing the progress on the revenue side as well. There are already a number of companies who are generating $1 billion or more in revenue from IoT and IoT-based services. So what are the building blocks? The way I kind of think about connected intelligence is you have a layer of sensors, billions of sensors, including mobile devices. You have the most important connectivity layer, and that's what we're going to delve into in a little bit. And then you have the intelligence layer, which is, you can call it AI, ML, autonomous intelligence, which is fed from data. So data feeds the algorithms, which makes sense of it, and feeds to the top layers. And then you have all the industries, healthcare, retail, transportation, and so on and so forth. And you're seeing some inclination of what's happening in the space with the likes of Uber and Airbnb and whatnot, and even in healthcare. Also, the important aspect of the trust, privacy, and security are critical. And as we go into connectivity, which is the critical factor, you see in the US, it has probably barring Korea, it has the highest penetration of any major market, ahead of Western Europe and China by a number of years. And even by the end of the decade, the US will be quite ahead. So clearly, US led in 4G penetration for a period of time. And as we approach 5G, we have to think about, what does it mean? How does the investment take place? What are the economics, and so on and so forth. Data traffic continues to grow rapidly, 60 to 70% growth annually in the US, even from a large base. And so that's going to be true going forward. I mean, it might decrease 50% to 50%, but it's still a massive amount of growth. I think it's estimated every household will consume 50 gigs a day by the end of the decade. And so it's a tremendous amount of data that's being consumed, created, and as such, we have to figure out how to manage that as well as what are the economics behind it. However, the worrying trend for the industry is also the dropping margins. And so the gap between revenue and cost continues to shrink down, and we have to acknowledge that reality and figure out solutions that help us mitigate some of these risks and challenges. But the good news is every time a new generation comes in, the level of revenue in the industry triples. And even with 4G, we're likely to see even higher than 3x, probably 5x. And given that number of players who are in the ecosystem, it's likely that 5G will exceed even that because the number of players that are coming into the ecosystem. The number of companies generating $1 billion or more in the mobile space continues to rise every year. And finally, kind of IoT as a revenue generator. If you go back in time, look at 15 years of data, the first few years of mobile data growth in revenue terms is mirroring the growth of IoT services revenue in the US. Obviously, data had a much sharper curve up, but IoT is kind of following that path, and it remains to be seen how fast that grows, how scalable that model is over the coming years and not. And that's what we plan to discuss. So with that, just wanted to quickly introduce the panel. To my immediate left, Tamara Casey, CTO of Legato Networks, Manish Jindal from Ericsson, Dr. Nermin Mohammed from Huawei, and Mike Murphy from Nokia. And so these are technologists who have been thinking about this for a long time. And as we get into 5G, kind of the thing that I wanted to ask about, first set the stage of what 5G means, and then get into how that is relevant to the crowd here. And so Mike, maybe you could get us started and talk about, from your vantage point, given the history you have with the industry, what does 5G mean to the industry? Give us a flavor of what everybody's thinking about with respect to, what 5G is, what's the definition, what are the markers that we can expect, and maybe perhaps even talk about some of the timelines that you expect.
Sure. So I think every generation, there's a secret formula for every G. Every G only does two things. One is it expands on current capabilities, so peak rates, capacity, basic capabilities like that. And it provides new tools that expand where you can use cellular for new revenue generating services. And in 5G, the case of the new tools is ultra low latency, high reliability. So that should enable new use cases and therefore new revenue sources. If we bring it down to IoT on the topic that we're discussing here, I think 5G brings both opportunities and challenges. So one, the opportunity is these technical capabilities that allow it to be used for things that you couldn't use it before, like industrial control or health-related services or autonomous driving. But it also brings some challenges with respect to, in particular, the frequencies we're looking at. They're not so well suited for propagation penetration, which gives some challenges for IoT. And also, I think, we took about 6 years to get LD at a point where we have low-cost chipsets that are coming out now for narrowband IT and CAT-M. It's going to take some time to get 5G down to the cost points that will be practical for 5G being used for IoT as well.
Manish, what's the best business case for 5G? Like, why should anybody worry about or think about 5G now?
Yeah, so when we talk about IoT, I'd like to split IoT or let's talk about machine type communication into two things. One is your massive machine type, and the other is critical machine type communication. And I think where our 3GPP technologies are going to have an advantage is in the critical type communication. You can either do it with a licensed spectrum, unlicensed spectrum, right? But when you're looking at licensed spectrum technology, especially 3GPP technologies, you get the quality of service, the security that comes along with that, and just a better managed network that comes along. So from a critical machine type communication type use cases, we will definitely see that 5G is going to play a much stronger role. The devices may not be that cheap for that, right? Because the number of devices in that category might be less, but the actual value for what you provide along with that is going to be much higher compared to the massive machine type communication. On the other hand, you do have unlicensed technologies, so it's not one certain technology that's going to be able to address all the markets. But then you also have markets where you need devices that are going to have less complexities, less requirements in terms of data throughput, or even in terms of the reliability, because those devices might have to transmit only once a day, or maybe once a month. It just depends. Versus having devices that might be used in healthcare or critical surgery or connected cars, etc. There you definitely need a very robust network, a network that you can rely on, and also very low latency. So I think that's where I see that 5G is definitely going to give us an advantage.
I mean, could operators think about 5G as two separate buckets? One is, super fast, super high, big pipe, and IoT. Can they live separately? Can one embark on the IoT track first without worrying about the broadband?
Yeah, that's correct. So actually what we're seeing right now is IoT is happening right now. And it's been like last year, there were like 10 billion connection. And as of right now, there is 12 billion connection using IoT. So there is no need to wait for 5G, and IoT is happening. And in order to understand the scope or the interaction between 5G and IoT, maybe we need to focus more on the scope of 5G and understand the incremental features and advantage provided by 5G. And if we look at this from an IoT perspective, there are three main aspects of 5G that are going to be enabler to IoT. The first one is the speed, and as we all know, 5G is going to deliver 10 gigabit per second, and this will enable ultra-high throughput. And this will be suitable for some use cases like virtual reality and augmented reality. And then if we talk about latency, it's going to provide 1 millisecond, which is going to enable ultra-reliable low latency communication, which is kind of suitable for smart manufacturing, connected car, driverless car, and other delay-sensitive application and services. And the last one is the connection, which Manish also mentioned, which is massive machine type communication. So there is no need to wait for 5G for some of the use cases, and some of the advanced use cases will have to wait for that. On the other hand, 4.5G is available right now, and as a matter of fact, there are around 35 networks being trialing and commercially deploying 4.5G, and this is from Huawei's perspective, and we're expecting this number to be doubled by end of this year. So as we move into 5G, we take advantage of the existing technology of 4.5G, unlicensed spectrum, and we wait for 5G for more advanced use cases and applications.
So tomorrow, it seems like there are a number of things that can be done with existing technologies as we go forward. Do you think there will be a marker where somebody can claim or industry can say, well, that looks like a 5G capability or a 5G network, and hence it's 5G? Or are we just going to kind of ease into 5G because it's kind of gradually getting there? 4.5, whatever, 4.75, 4.9G, and getting into 5G.
Yeah, I think as with any evolution, like you were referencing in your opening slides, there's a natural transition period associated with these things. And there's been recent work in 3GPP, which we're very interested in terms of the new FEMTC work item, kind of a 4.5, 4.75G precursor to massive machine type communications in the 5G standard. So I think, for us, it's really about, making sure you have the right technology capabilities to suit the needs of the use case and being less concerned about which G bucket it falls into. So we're traditionally a satellite operator. Our focus is on a satellite and terrestrial hybrid network. Again, we're targeting a 4.5, 4.75 type of technology from a terrestrial perspective. But we also embrace, the unlicensed technologies, proprietary technologies. For us, I really agree with what Manish said about you have to sort of separate IoT into, I don't know if it's 2 buckets, but definitely multiple buckets. And for us, that focus is really on the mission critical and autonomous applications and taking advantage of a collection of technologies, both that are incumbents in those industries, as well as bringing the commercial technologies along with our advanced satellite capability to serve those needs. So I think 5G is a natural transition. It's just an ongoing evolution, same as we've seen before. I think it is evolution. It may be in terms of implementation, it may be revolution in terms of technology capability, but I think it's evolution from an implementation standpoint.
So, you have an interesting approach of using satellite and terrestrial network. If an operator is thinking about, working with a spreadsheet, trying to figure out the economics of building a network or leasing a network, where does satellite fit into that? For what use cases will you be using satellite versus terrestrial?
Yeah, I think the historical challenge in satellite, honestly, has been the cost and the form factor of the devices, right? And we were very fortunate in 2011. We were able to work with Boeing and Viasat and launch SkyTerra 1 satellite. It's extremely powerful. It's a narrowband satellite, but it's extremely powerful and capable satellite that actually allows us to complete the link budget to very small form factor devices, which can take advantage of commercial off-the-shelf technology from a modem perspective and be small battery-powered devices. So really being able to drive down the cost curve on the devices and increase the capabilities is important, and we have what we believe is really the most industry-leading commercial satellite in the mid-band spectrum today. So we think that's a unique advantage that we have, but I think all satellite operators you see focused on trying to bring down cost, bring down the size of the form factors, to be able to support a more reasonable deployment model. And then also, there's a lot of competition in the satellite business today in the high throughput side in terms of the players out there, so that's helping bring down costs as well. So something that has historically been sort of perceived as a niche type of technology is really becoming much more mainstream, and us and others are getting very active in the standards bodies about, hey, don't forget about these capabilities, because they really can enrich things, particularly when you're 23,000 miles out in orbit. So it adds another level of reliability and redundancy and security to these connections, and so I think it's something people need to consider. But it's obviously an expensive endeavor to get into it, so I'd encourage you to consider partnerships more than more than undertaking designing and building and launching satellites. That's not for the faint of heart. But there are a number of really interesting opportunities and providers out there, proposed new ones that are coming. And I think it's very important, particularly for this audience, to keep an eye on what is going on in the satellite industry and how you can take advantage of some of these advanced capabilities. For us, it's when you start with a place of pervasive coverage, the terrestrial kind of builds that you do, particularly if you're IoT focused, are very different. Frankly, they're capacity builds. They're designed to offload payload from these mission-critical applications and technologies, and it's much more about a capacity and very customized type of network deployment, as opposed to having to go out there and get that blanket coverage everywhere.
Yeah.
You know, on the 5G, when you started out in terms of the, you know, the definition, et cetera, unlike previous technologies, you know, 5G was also created based on a lot of the use cases people started thinking about. So the technology was initially built around, you know, some of the use cases that we thought might be pretty forward-looking. And I say the biggest use case is the one that you haven't thought about.
Yeah.
Now, as we went along, then we realized, okay, so 5G, let's say, from a standardization perspective, happens phase 1, 2018, phase 2, 2019. What do we do in the meantime? So this is where we took a lot of the aspects of 5G, and we actually, since there were software changes, we started applying them to LTE. And now, whether you want to call it LTE Advanced Pro, 4.5, 7, 8, you know, it's basically applying a lot of those principles that we thought initially will be 5G and bringing it back to 4G so that our customers actually can take advantage of those software improvements. And actually, they are able to extend their investments that they've made, excuse me, on LTE side. And so those are some of the things that Norman was also talking about, you know, is things like massive MIMO, MU MIMO, things like, you know, bringing down the cost curve on the devices. So on one hand, we are going to give multi-gigabit per second of speeds, but on the other hand, we are driving the cost down also because that's what IoT is going to help us with. So you're looking at the narrowband IoT, where we're saying, you know, the cost of the chipsets could come down from where an LTE might be around $40 to maybe sub $5, right? And that would be our goal with the narrowband IoT.
So should the CCA operators ignore the noise about 5G and focus on the capabilities that are coming between now and 2018, 19?
It's a plan, right? It's a plan that to say, you know, my goal is to get to an endpoint, let's call it, say, 2020, 2021. But then it's a stepwise approach because it's not just about access technologies, because the only way we will be able to address these use cases that we haven't about is not only on the access side, it's also on the core, looking at much more. So you get your core networks, we take advantage of that, and then
Necessarily 5G, FM, narrowband IoT. Now, maybe they will, maybe there's
Where, what are the pros and cons of?
Right now. So you kind of approach spectrum such as limited. The carrier will not deploy. They determine the best connectivity of it is more than the access or connectivity. When we do that is big data or analytics. When we talk about big data or analytics, there is like real-time analytics which can help with like autonomic network, like driverless car, or maybe smart manufacturing, Industry 4.0. And also there is another aspect of big data, which is kind of like rated #1 use case in Europe, which is predictive maintenance. You need to have a predictive analytics in order to provide predictive maintenance. We actually did some trial in Germany for predictive maintenance, and we achieved 80% reduction in the fault by deploying predictive maintenance. So there are so many aspects, but when we look at this, we need to have a whole holistic solution, determine the best access part, determine the best business model, and based on that, you determine the deployment strategy from the core network, creating your slicing, have the intelligence using analytics and policy, and kind of orchestrate and manage your network in order to support IoT use cases.
Mike, one of the critical issues is likely to be the backhaul and transport. How should operators think about preparing their networks or allocating budgets to prepare for an upgrade with respect to backhaul? And are there certain things that need to happen on the regulatory side to help make that happen?
Sure. So as we all talked that, you know, every generation edges into the next generation. There's a gray zone that starts happening, and LTE will edge into 5G, and 5G will edge into 6G. So as we progress along 4G, we need to do some things on the backhaul because there's, guess what, more capacity coming, lower latency services coming in R14, 3GPP R14. In 5G, it goes, you know, another degree. So on the backhaul side, to support that, it needs some very fundamental architectural changes. You can't support high capacity without doing something, obviously. And you don't get low latency for free. You can't have a network operations center every 5,000 miles or something so far. So we see that the network will become far more distributed, things go to the edge, and basically that means a transport network overhaul. So I think in this cycle of improving on 4G and getting ready for 5G, there's some very fundamental architectural changes required in the transport network. And whether regulatory requirements are needed to support that, I mean, well, I guess in some sense there may be, because not everybody owns their own transport network, so you'll need some aspect of fair pricing support from the regulatory bodies.
And I think it depends on the use cases also, right? If you're looking at use cases that don't require a lot of transaction or doesn't require massive amounts of data, the current networks might just be okay. It's we're talking about obviously if it is VR type applications, AR, they will require a lot of bandwidth. And then obviously Chairman Wheeler did talk about his desire and to help in this regulation from a backhaul perspective, et cetera. So there's definitely hope that it'll move in the right direction. Definitely, yeah. And then from a backhaul perspective, now you do have other opportunities. So fiber is definitely there, but then as you could use these millimeter wave spectrums also as one of the other alternatives to take data out of the location where it needs to the other place. So it can be a lot of, whether it's in-band, whether you look at E-band, a lot of microwave. So there'll be multiple technologies that will end up getting used in the backhaul.
All right, what are some of the use cases? Like, where do you see the demand? For IoT in general, but say, the best economic way to transfer the bit from point A to point B might be a satellite. What are some of those use cases?
Yeah, I think, let me just also touch on your question about, should the audience, sort of not be too concerned about 5G or something. And I think, it's important that everyone be focused on emerging technologies, but it's also important to, as has been previously mentioned, look at the technologies that are available today, whether that's unlicensed, the shared access spectrum in 3.5, legacy types of technologies that may be embedded within a particular vertical. So I think it's important to constantly look at technology holistically, and one of the points that was made was make those incremental steps and investments that are not painful. Change outs or massive augmentations to a radio access network are very complicated and typically very expensive. Changes to the core technologies today are becoming much more cost effective. I agree completely with the comment about looking at moving your core closer to the edge for a number of these use cases, maybe not, unilaterally, but on a targeted basis. We think that's critically important. So whether it's billing systems, the OSS systems that my colleagues mentioned, all of these things are incremental steps in preparation that can be taken. And then you can target the radio access technologies you need, again, whether they're standards-based, this generation, next generation, proprietary, whatever they might be, to meet those use cases. So for us, the use case question is really the critical question. And I think the thing that is most important for the operators to think about is don't think of yourself as a connectivity provider. And you heard from the CEOs on their panel yesterday, the industry is really starting to focus on solutions. And we have to think of ourselves as systems integrators and solution providers and partner with the vendors in order to meet those needs of the customer. And to do that, you have to get out there. You've got to talk to these customers. You've got to understand what they want. We have a unique advantage in our existing satellite customer base, and we work very, very actively with them to define what they need. How are we meeting their needs today on satellite? How can we make that better? How can we make that more cost effective? What does terrestrial augmentation mean? Is that best served through a standards-based technology or a proprietary technology? And how do we bring those together? And in many cases, these verticals do not want to necessarily, own and operate and try and have to serve as a system integrator themselves.
How do these smaller operators build vertical expertise without massive investments? But they might be, instead of, Verizon or AT&T might have hundreds of customers in a given vertical, so it justifies the cost and investment. if somebody has maybe a dozen
Yeah.
customers,
Okay.
maybe it doesn't justify the investment in building SI expertise in that domain.
Yeah.
So how do you pull and aggregate demand?
So a couple things. First, partner, partner, partner. I think IoT is a space where we have to start thinking about changing business models and changing relationships to get at these points you're raising. So I think partnerships are critically important. I think, also know the verticals that you're most interested in serving and that you can serve in a way that really supports the revenue model and the support model that you mentioned. And that may mean that you want to focus on truly narrowband devices and low-cost devices, and you're uniquely set up to serve that. It may mean that you're uniquely set up to serve these more rural healthcare types of use cases. If that's your thing, focus on that. It's focus, partnership, and really understanding and picking your verticals. If you try to be everything to everybody in IoT, you're going to fail. And I think that's why we've seen some of the delays in the adoptions and the fragmentation of technology. It's just been, it's too much. It's almost like sensory overload. And so you've got to, pick verticals that you can accelerate in. So those may be partners within your specific geographies that you want to target and work with, and then understand their use cases. And crawl, walk, run. Get it right. Start small, get it right, and figure out how you expand and grow from there. But I think partnership is absolutely key.
Yeah.
So,
I think,
just a quick question around kind of taking the same thought of partnership from a SI function to what is an issue for CC operators around, say, devices, and will become an issue around modules for IoT. So is there a mechanism that you would recommend to pool that demand so that they get some scale in pricing, or just understanding from each other as to where the demand is, and how, be more judicious about their investment?
Yeah, and it's, the one thing, and I totally agree with you, Tamara, the focus definitely has to be there. And then it's, it depends on which layer you play at, right? So if you want to just play at the connectivity layer, there's a play for that. But then as you get up the stack, the value will start to increase. And in terms of our CC operators, you all know your communities better than anyone else, right? So you know exactly what those communities are going to need. So whether, let's take some examples of whether it's industries, healthcare, rural healthcare is definitely needs something like this, agriculture, those kind of cases. So you have to stay away from building purpose-built architecture also. So you build an architecture where you have a connectivity layer, then you have some of the IoT enablers, you have your analytics engine. So you create a platform, and then after that you start to use those intelligence to drive different applications. Applications are not that expensive, but they are the ones that are going to create value. But for applications to be, if they don't have the right information and the intelligence, then obviously they're only as good as the kind of data. So if you're able to build that around your intelligence that you have from your communities, you have an advantage on that. And when you have an advantage, collectively you can definitely create that device ecosystem and the price points that are coming in. Number two is the price of these devices will come down, right? Because the chipsets are going to come down. And that's why I was talking about from $40 to sub $5. So that cost is going to come down also. Number three, it doesn't always have to be only licensed cellular technologies. It can be a combination of these also. So you also talk about sometimes capillary networks, where you have certain technologies that help you with the first, let's say, few meters. And then you aggregate that information, and then that information can be taken up to your intelligence systems through your cellular networks. So it's a combination of these things that you can do to reduce the cost points also.
Mike, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I think, it's incumbent on us, on the vendor side, to create very flexible end-to-end solutions so that this becomes much easier at, say, the competitive carrier level. So we need to do a lot of the work to simplify the whole solution, and perhaps provide some solutions on verticals that can be tailored in an easy way. But mobile broadband is an inherently distant type of service. You don't really care what somebody is doing at the other end. Or connectivity is also, just basic connectivity for IoT is also a little bit distant. But you can't get away from the customer intimacy when you want to go end-to-end. And that's, like Manish said, is where the competitive carriers have a leg up, I think, in having that customer intimacy.
So when you mentioned analytics platform or other forms of platform, so should they invest in their own analytics platform, or is there a common layer that everybody should drive towards? That maybe 2, 10, 100 operators can tap into the same cloud-based analytics platform. Like, what's the ideal architecture for smaller operators?
I don't know if there's one particular architecture. I think the standard architecture will be there that people follow, but how you fulfill in a particular layer is definitely going to be up to because there are going to be solutions that are that scale massively, but then your startup cost is going to be very, very high. Mm-hmm. Whereas you've got now, especially with cloud, solutions can scale up and scale down. Mm-hmm. So you can use multi-tenancy. So 10, 20, 50 operators come in and say, okay, we want to create this platform. There are vendors that can provide that solution on the cloud that scales up and down with multi-tenancy. I think that's going to be extremely important to tap into that.
Norman, a lot of large operators are considering kind of overhauling their OSS, BSS, and core for IoT, having a separate IoT core and rethinking about the billing engine and so on and so forth. At what point does that, from a decision-making point of view, at what point should smaller operators worry about having a separate IoT core? What the traffic or the units need to be before the current architecture cannot handle it?
Yeah, so that's actually correct. So when we come into planning for IoT, we need to look first at the business model and kind of understand what the carrier is trying to achieve. And when we look at the business model, I want to kind of add that carriers need to get out from the traditional B2C model, and they want to expand it to what we call B2X. They need to consider B2B, B2B, B2H, and all other business innovation models that can enable them to bring more revenue. And based on this business model, they need to kind of look into the service strategy and try to prioritize the application and the services they want to deploy as part of IoT. And based on these services, they need to establish their IoT platform strategy. And like Manish mentioned, IoT platform is simply connectivity management, application enablement, and data analytics. So once they define this IoT platform, there is the trade-off between building their IoT platform or outsourcing their IoT platform. And like this, there are trade-offs. If we have a competence to build IoT platform, maybe big operators can do that. However, for small operators, it makes sense to have to outsource it. However, the main idea is to have a horizontal IoT platform which supports any type of access technology, either a gateway or a cellular or unlicensed or any kind of access technology, and also be able to be managed and orchestrated by OSS, BSS. And then carriers need to think from a TCO and financial analysis. Does it make sense to kind of reutilize the existing core in order to support IoT service, or the traffic and the demand is way beyond what the existing core can support, and then at this stage they need to move into a separate core for IoT. Another aspect, like we talked about it, is most of the carriers right now, they don't have a virtualized core. And at some point, they have to move into a virtualized core. So my recommendation, once you move into virtualized, maybe you start virtualizing this, have the slices for IoT, and then start moving the legacy traffic into that if it can support more. So when the carrier try to plan, let's take it from business side and kind of nail it down until we reach to the core. And like you mentioned, we need to have the OSS in place. We need to have the orchestration and automation in place in order to support some advanced IoT services.
Good. Only 2 or so minutes left. Kind of the final question around, if you have one message to give to the audience that they should take back to their respective organizations and really think about in the next few months with respect to IoT, the opportunity, the challenges, how they should go about thinking about investments and revenue opportunities, what it would be. And we'll start with you.
I think, just touching on what I mentioned before, look at what you can do now and start, sort of taking this in bite-sized chunks, whether it's virtualization, even if that's maybe deploying virtualization specifically for the purpose of IoT, or specifically in conjunction with, lab trials we may be doing around IoT or 5G types of technology. So, get familiar with these things. Make the investments in the OSS and BSS. Do not underestimate the complexity of the security requirements that are coming from these things. We all need to become cybersecurity experts now. How can you focus on that today? Some of these applications, things like healthcare or law enforcement type of applications, there's huge privacy issues that were mentioned yesterday, HIPAA compliance issues, things like this. So really important to make the incremental progress that you can now. Consider partnering. Take advantage of that, customer intimacy you have in your local areas where you know the businesses and the consumers in those areas better than anybody else, and start to, pick small incremental wins where you can be successful. And finally, I think the perhaps most important aspect is what you want to do. You really know what you want to do. Know your space. Know what you want to go after. Understand those requirements, as was mentioned, understand it from the business model perspective, and then what technology you need to enable that. Don't let the technology take you down a path that leads you somewhere that you didn't have the business models to support this. As was mentioned previously, one of the best things that's come out of 5G is it was use case driven standards. It wasn't, chasing speeds and feeds. It was for the first time that we said, what are we trying to do with this technology, and defined, use cases associated with the technologies, and then back the technology development into meeting the needs of those use cases. And it's critically important. If that, nothing else ever came out of 5G, that might be the most critical thing that came out of 5G, is really forcing us to focus on the business models and the use cases, and then how we use technology to enable that cost effectively.
Manish, what would you like to add?
I know we're out of time here, so I would say, your customer intimacy, your understanding of your markets better than anyone else, and then diversity of your networks. It is one network that actually will help you do your standard mobile broadband, your standard voice services, etc., plus along with that IoT. That single network needs to be able to handle all these other things. And the only way you can do that is making your networks more flexible. So start with the flexibility on the core side, use the software technologies that are bringing in from 5G into 4G, and then keep a tab on 5G as the new spectrums come along, plan for those spectrums.
Final words?
Yeah, so if I talk about IoT, my recommendation is don't wait for 5G, don't wait for next evolution, just you need to act right now. IoT is needed now. And the way I'm saying it's needed now because it's directly mapped to our lifestyle, which is being elevated every day. So people want to be happy, want to be more productive, want to be more social, and have more efficiency. So we need to act right now. And in the 4 words I want to say, the 4 key words for IoT strategy is: first is open. Make sure that when you deploy your IoT platform, it's open and it can support multiple technology. The second one, innovation, and innovation not only on the network or the service side, but also on the business side. Get out of the traditional business model and innovate in the business model. The third thing is don't fear of changes, and kind of go out there and attack the market, get new use cases, and provide more value to the customer. And the last thing is when you do your business plan and your service plan, have a minimum disruption. You have your spectrum available, you have your existing network available. Try to utilize the existing asset and build on top of that in moving into your futuristic network, deploying SDN, NFV, and slicing and automation.
Mike.
Okay, last one. So I think I agree with all the previous comments. The thing is, start now. You don't have to wait for 5G. It has a few capabilities that you may or may not need coming. And the other thing wasn't discussed is, where do you play? Connectivity is the easiest, but also the least lucrative, but it's the easiest one to start. As you go up the chain or go up the hierarchy towards end-to-end capabilities, it requires more effort, but it's also more rewarding. And I think if you go up into a vertical, you need to have that intimacy, both on the customer side and actually understanding the application in depth. So you have to make that decision where you're going to play.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking the panelists. I think it was a great discussion around IoT. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists, and thank you, Chetan, for skillfully leading our experts through, I think, some very interesting and useful information for everyone. Before you leave, please take a moment to fill out the evaluation forms on your table. Your feedback is important to us, and it could be cash in your pocket, and I'll tell you about that in just a second, but a few announcements. Breakout sessions begin at 9:30. I encourage you to attend. Pick out a partner session there, and that the events committee has worked on and planned. And I'd like to thank all the events committee for their unwavering work of bringing the educational sessions to the forefront. So thank you, events committee, very much. Appreciate it. I'd like to remind you the exhibit hall opens at noon, and we'll be serving lunch there. So you may want to come and have some lunch. Stop by the booths. Absolutely visit the exhibitors and your colleagues there. Following lunch, we'll have a number of our extraordinary breakout sessions. And then this afternoon, we have a do not miss event. At 3:30, we'll be joined by John Stanton of Trilogy International Partners. Come grab a cup of coffee. Join me and dozens of our carriers that help sponsor this afternoon session for a fireside chat with John Stanton, followed by the CCA Annual Achievement Awards. And at the end of that, that's where the cash comes in. We'll reconvene the exhibit hall at 4:30 to 6:30, but the cash prize will be given out right after the first $500 cash prize will be given out right after the Achievement Awards. You have to be present to win. And then we're going to give some more money and cash prizes, as well as your passport to prizes out at 6:15 in the exhibit hall. So hopefully you'll have an opportunity to come visit there, and we should have plenty of food and drink there also. So thank you one and all. Please enjoy the day, and we'll see you back in here at 3:30. Thank you.